Normandy, France, June 7th, 1944. Before sunrise, a German officer sits on the ground with wet sand stuck to his cuffs and salt crusted on his lips. He's not some wide-eyed kid. This man has been through the Eastern Front. He's lived through winters that killed stronger men. He knows what fear is supposed to feel like. But this is different. The British commando questioning him isn't yelling. He isn't even trying to sound tough. He just talks. In German, not classroom German, not the slow, careful words a foreigner uses when they're afraid to mess up. This is smooth, native, the kind of German where every slang word lands right, every phrase sounds like home. The commando catches small details too, little things you only notice if you grew up inside that world. How officers talk when they think they're in charge. How soldiers dodge blame. How a man's accent can give away where he's from. The German officer stares at the uniform, British patches, British gear, British boots, and yet the voice in his ears sounds like Berlin, or Vienna, or maybe Munich. Either way, it sounds like Germany. The commando leans in and starts dropping specifics. Unit identifiers, the name of a commander, where a headquarters is supposed to be. Not vague guesses. Details that make the officer's stomach tighten. The officer finally blurts out the only question that makes sense. How do you know that? The commando's face stays calm. His expression doesn't soften. And the answer, in perfect German, lands like a punch. Because I know your world from the inside. The officer's skin goes pale because he suddenly understands what kind of enemy this is. Not just a British soldier. A man the Reich claimed was gone. A man who was supposed to be erased. A man the Nazis called inferior, now standing here in a British uniform, speaking German better than Germans, turning their own identity into a weapon. This wasn't normal warfare anymore. This was something that crawled into a soldier's head and stayed there. And that's the core of this story. A unit that shouldn't have existed. A unit built from refugees, mostly German and Austrian Jews, who volunteered to fight the regime that hunted them. Men who knew that if they were captured, they wouldn't be treated like normal prisoners of war. For them, the rules were thinner, the danger was higher, the consequences were brutal. Yet they went anyway. They became one of Britain's sharpest psychological blades in the European war. They were known as X-Troop. To understand how they ended up on the beaches of Normandy, you have to go back before the commandos, before D-Day, before the Allied armies crossed the Channel. You have to go back to the moment life in Germany and Austria cracked wide open. In 1938, violence against Jewish communities exploded into public, organized attacks. Synagogues burned, businesses smashed, families terrorized. Thousands tried to flee. Some made it out. Many didn't. Among the ones who escaped were young men who, on paper, looked like a security nightmare for Britain. They were German nationals, Austrian nationals, people who spoke the enemy's language as their first language. Some still had family trapped under Nazi control. If Britain put them in uniform, the Nazis could punish their relatives. If these men were captured, their very presence in the British Army could be used for propaganda. And if you're thinking like a normal military planner, you'd say, no way, too risky. But war has a habit of creating strange openings for people who can do things nobody else can. A British intelligence officer named Dudley Clark saw something that others missed. These refugees didn't just speak German, they were raised in it. They understood the culture, the social rules, the status games, the way German military pride worked, the way a German soldier might react when embarrassed, threatened, or offered a face-saving exit. That kind of knowledge can't be trained in a few months. It can't be faked convincingly under pressure. You either have it or you don't. And Clark realized that if Britain could shape these men into commandos, disciplined, controlled, professional, then they could do things a normal commando could not. They could interrogate faster, infiltrate smoother, confuse enemy troops at the worst possible moment, break morale without firing a shot. But there was another layer to this. One the Nazis themselves couldn't understand. Why would these men volunteer? From a Nazi viewpoint, it made no sense. They'd call it brainwashing or artificial courage. Anything except the truth. The truth is simpler and heavier. These men were being told they didn't belong in the world, that they had no right to exist, that they would be wiped out and forgotten. And volunteering to fight wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about anger, even though they had plenty of reasons to be angry. It was proof. Proof they were still here. Proof the Reich couldn't fully erase them. Proof that the ideology calling them weak was a lie. By 1942, Britain officially formed this group as part of Number 10, Inter-Allied Commando, commonly referred to as 3 Troop, but widely remembered as X Troop. Roughly 87 men, mostly German and Austrian Jews, along with a few others who had escaped from occupied Europe. Britain gave many of them anglicized names, not as a magic shield, nothing would truly protect them if captured, but because in war you take every thin layer of protection you can get. They trained like commandos train. Hard miles, brutal obstacle courses, live fire pressure, demolition work, close combat. The kind of training designed to break you down and rebuild you. And they made it through. Not because they were superheroes, because they were motivated in a way most armies don't know how to manufacture. Some British trainers noticed something unusual during combat drills. These men didn't need to be pumped up to attack. In some cases, they needed to be coached to control it, to stay disciplined, not reckless. Training wasn't just about aggression, it was about restraint. That matters because this unit wasn't created to be a revenge squad. It was created to be effective. Their true weapon wasn't rage, it was precision. And part of that precision was learning how to use language like a blade. They trained on interrogation methods, psychological pressure, and the subtle art of getting information without turning every prisoner into a silent wall. They learned how to exploit hierarchy, pride, dialect, regional identity, anything that could crack open a rigid answer. Because when you're fighting a modern war, information moves armies. Now, if you're enjoying this kind of story, the ones that don't show up in the usual war movies, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next parts. This is one of those WWII rabbit holes that changes how you see the whole European theater. Then came the moment the Allies had been building toward June 6, 1944, D-Day. While the world remembers the beaches as a storm of bullets and blood, X-Troops' role was different from the standard image people carry in their heads. They weren't there to be the main spearhead. They were there to exploit chaos, to turn confusion into surrender, to pull intelligence out of the shockwave while the battlefield was still shaking. About 27 men from X-Troop landed in the opening wave period, spread across areas like Sword and Juno. The exact beach assignments varied, but the purpose stayed the same. Get in early, move fast, and start turning captured Germans into usable information. Immediately. Picture one of them pushing through surf, heavy kit dragging, the air full of smoke and salt. A bunker up ahead keeps firing, pinning down men who can't cross open sand. A standard attack might be grenades or a coordinated push, but X-Troop had another option. One of these commandos stands up where he can be heard and calls out to the bunker in German, not a generic shout, something specific, something personal to the defenders. He identifies their unit, names an officer, describes the position like he's been studying it. Then he offers a choice that hits a German soldier right in the gut. Surrender now, cleanly, to an enemy who understands your rules, or keep firing and get erased by artillery that doesn't care who you are. That kind of moment creates a mental crash because the defenders are trying to process an impossible picture. A British soldier speaking like a native German, knowing details he shouldn't know, using their own military identity against them, and doing it confidently, like he belongs in the conversation. The firing stops, hands come up, and suddenly a bunker that might have cost dozens of lives is neutralized, partly by words. This wasn't propaganda leaflets, it wasn't loudspeakers. It was a different kind of psychological warfare, the terror of realizing your enemy understands you and you don't understand him at all. Across Normandy, that pattern repeated in different forms. At Juno, another X-Troop man interrogates prisoners while the ground still trembles from bombardment. He shifts his German based on who he's talking to, matching tone, matching regional cues, building a sense of familiarity that disarms a man's defenses before he even realizes what's happening. It's not friendly, it's not soft, it's controlled, and it works because cultural identity is powerful. A soldier can resist threats, a soldier can resist yelling, but it's much harder to resist the sudden feeling that the person across from you is one of us, even when you know he's not. Within days, X-Troop had processed huge numbers of prisoners for a unit that small. And the intelligence they pulled, unit locations, officer names, defensive layouts, morale, flowed fast to British command. Some British summaries from the period described their interrogation success as dramatically higher than standard rates, not because these men tortured prisoners, but because they removed the usual language barrier and replaced it with something worse for the enemy: a mirror. German prisoners were forced to look at themselves through the eyes of someone who knew Germany, understood German pride, and still chose to fight against the Reich. That caused confusion, shame, doubt, and sometimes a strange kind of need to explain themselves. Meanwhile, German officers started hearing reports that didn't fit their worldview. British troops with native-level German, interrogators who sounded too real, prisoners insisting again and again that the men questioning them weren't trained linguists. They were German-born. From the German side, it sounded implausible, so they treated it like a mystery, like a security breach, like a trick. They didn't want to face the truth that people they declared unworthy were now using German language and culture as a weapon against Germany. And here's where the story tightens, because D-Day wasn't the peak of what X-Troop could do. It was the introduction, the moment the Reich first felt the cold edge of something it couldn't categorize, something that didn't just defeat units, but infected confidence. And after Normandy, X-Troop's work moved into darker spaces between front lines, missions where their German voices could open doors that British bullets never could. That's where Part 2 goes. For now, hold on to this image. A German officer shaking, not because he's about to die. He's made peace with death a long time ago. He's shaking because the man speaking to him sounds like home, and home was supposed to be gone. By late summer 1944, the map in France is changing fast. American armor is pushing hard. British and Canadian forces are grinding forward, town by town. On paper, it looks like a straightforward chase. Pressure the Germans, keep them off balance, keep moving east. But in the real world, wars don't move on paper. They move on information. And that's the problem the Allies keep running into. As the front line shifts, German units reposition, retreat, scramble, and hide. Command posts move, supply dumps relocate, new defensive lines appear overnight, and the faster you advance, the easier it is to outrun your own intelligence. That's where X-Troop gets even more valuable, because Normandy was only the first time they showed what they could do in open combat chaos. After Normandy, they start operating in places most people never picture when they think WWII commandos. Farm lanes at 2 a.m., quiet hedgerows behind enemy lines, villages where one wrong accent can get you killed. These missions don't show up in the big movie montages because they're not loud, they're not clean, and for a long time, many were kept quiet for obvious reasons. But the idea is simple. If you can sound like the enemy, you can get closer than anyone expects. And if you can get close, you can do things that feel impossible. One type of mission shows up again and again in accounts of X-Troop operations: targeted snatches, not a full-scale raid, not a big firefight. A quick penetration to grab a specific person, usually someone with real value: staff officers, intelligence personnel, communication specialists, men who know the passwords, the call signs, the unit movements, the plans. Alive, because a dead officer can't talk. And in 1944, talking is worth more than any single weapon system. Picture a small team moving at night. 6 men, maybe fewer. Their gear is quiet. Their movements are careful. They aren't guessing where the Germans will be. They're predicting it because they understand how German security routines work. They know where sentries are likely placed. They know what a German guard sounds like when he's relaxed versus when he's nervous. They know the rhythm of challenge and password checks, and they know how German units tend to react to reports of nearby enemy activity. That knowledge isn't theoretical, it's lived experience. At some point, the team reaches a building, often something ordinary, like a farmhouse being used as a temporary headquarters. There are guards outside, smoking, talking low. And here's the key moment. Instead of creeping up and hoping nobody sees them, the ex-troop lead walks straight in. Not in English, in German. He calls out urgently, like he belongs there, like he's part of the same army, like he has a problem that needs an immediate officer response. Maybe he claims enemy paratroopers landed nearby. Maybe he says his unit got hit and he needs orders. The exact cover story can vary, but the method is consistent. Use confidence and correct language to create a brief window where guards hesitate. And hesitation is everything. A trained guard doesn't need minutes to stop you. He needs seconds. Those seconds are enough. The rest of the team moves in behind the voice. Fast, efficient, controlled, quiet weapons, quick takedowns, minimal noise. Inside, the target officer reaches for his pistol or tries to stand, and suddenly he's facing men in British uniforms who speak German like locals. That moment does something to a prisoner's mind because he's trying to solve a puzzle under extreme stress. Are these British using captured Germans as translators? Are these Germans forced into service? Is this some kind of trick? Then the ex-troop lead calls him by name, rank, possibly even by unit, and the prisoner realizes the answer that feels worst of all. These aren't forced Germans, they're Germans who chose to fight against the Reich. In German accounts after the war, a word comes up in connection with encounters like this. Not just defeat, not just capture, betrayal. That's how it hits them. And it's an ugly irony, because the men they call traitors are Jewish refugees whose families were targeted by the regime in the first place. But ideology doesn't make room for that logic. The ideology demands loyalty, no matter how insane the demand is. Once the prisoner is secured, the team has to do the hardest part, getting out. And this is where ex-troops' particular skills become almost unfair. They don't just know German, they know how Germans verify identity. They know the cadence of the challenge, the expected response, the way a guard's voice changes when he thinks he recognizes you. So if they have the right password, taken from a captured log, overheard from enemy traffic, or learned through interrogation, they can sometimes walk back through German-held ground without raising alarms. A German sentry hears proper German pronunciation, hears the right response, and waves them through. Meanwhile, the prisoner, bound and furious, watches his own side unknowingly help deliver him into Allied hands. If you want to understand why this messes with morale, imagine being that officer. You don't just feel outplayed. You feel violated. Your own systems failed. Your own people helped. Your own language became the key. Now zoom out. Those night operations weren't just about collecting information. They created stories, whispers that spread through units. British troops speaking perfect German, commandos who vanish into the dark, men who know our routines. Even when details got exaggerated, the core fear remained. The enemy might be among you, and you can't tell by the sound of his voice. That erodes trust, and trust is what holds exhausted troops together. German security directives begin shifting emphasis. Instead of relying on language alone, units are pushed toward personal verification, recognizing faces, confirming details that can't be faked, requiring more checks. That's a sign of real damage, because more checks slow everything down. More checks create confusion. More checks create friction in an army that's already under stress. And this is the hidden effect of ex-troop. They don't just steal information. They force the enemy to change behavior in ways that make the enemy less effective. But ex-troops' influence isn't limited to the field. By fall 1944, Allied holding areas are overflowing with German prisoners. Thousands and thousands. Standard interrogation is often a slog. Language barriers, cultural misunderstanding. Prisoners trained to give only name, rank, and number. Some are fanatical. Some are terrified. Some are simply done with the war and want to survive. Then ex-troop personnel enter the interrogation rooms, and the entire tone changes. One classic method they use is simple: familiarity. An interrogator sits across from a prisoner who's trying to stay stiff and military. The prisoner recites his routine information and locks his face down. He believes he can outlast the questioner. The ex-troop interrogator lets him finish, then starts speaking in the prisoner's own regional dialect, not as an act, not as a trick, as a natural voice. And instead of jumping straight into military questions, he brings up home, not in a sentimental way, in a matter-of-fact way, like two people from the same city making small talk. Street names, neighborhoods, landmarks, the way locals describe parts of town. The prisoner's eyes shift, because that kind of detail is hard to hear from an enemy. And now the prisoner is facing a living contradiction, a man in a British uniform who knows his city like a neighbor, and might even be from there. That contradiction creates a need inside the prisoner, a need to explain, to ask questions, to understand what he's looking at. "You're from here," he might say. And the ex-troop interrogator might answer calmly that yes, he's from that district. Then in a plain tone he may mention why he left, that his community was driven out, that a synagogue was destroyed, that he's not speaking as a propaganda poster, he's speaking as someone who remembers. At that point, a prisoner's training starts failing, not because he's being threatened, because he's uncomfortable in his own beliefs. He has spent years surrounded by a closed system, propaganda reinforcing propaganda, ideology reinforcing ideology, pressure reinforcing fear. Now he's forced to talk to someone who understands German culture deeply, but isn't inside the Nazi worldview. It creates cognitive dissonance so strong it can crack discipline. Allied observers noted that ex-troop interrogators often didn't need intimidation. They didn't need yelling. They didn't need physical pressure. They needed timing. They'd let the prisoner feel the contradiction and try to solve it. And while the prisoner's mind was busy wrestling with identity and pride and shame, the interrogator would steer the conversation toward tactical details, unit locations, numbers, morale, supply routes, and prisoners talked. Sometimes it was because they wanted to survive. Sometimes it was because they were disoriented. Sometimes it was because, strangely, they seemed to crave approval, not from Britain, but from a representative of real German culture, the Germany that existed before the Nazi takeover. That's the psychological angle most people miss. Ex-troop wasn't just using language. They were using pre-war German identity as leverage. They became a mirror showing prisoners what Germany had been and what it had become. In some interrogations, the effect is even sharper. Ex-troop interrogators could dismantle Nazi claims using calm logic and deep cultural knowledge, history, philosophy, literature, not in a debate club way, in a way that makes a young soldier realize he's been fed a cheap version of his own culture. And the most brutal part, psychologically, is this. The prisoner has been taught that Jews are inferior, but the interrogator across from him speaks better German, understands Germany more deeply, and often speaks multiple languages with ease. So the prisoner is forced into an impossible question. If the ideology is true, why does reality keep contradicting it? That question alone can break a man's certainty. And certainty is what the Reich needed most by late 1944, when the battlefield situation was collapsing. By the end of 1944, ex-troop personnel had interrogated enormous numbers of prisoners. The intelligence was practical, routes, defenses, weak points, but the deeper effect spread through the camps like a slow infection. Prisoners talked to other prisoners. They shared what happened in the interrogation rooms. They whispered about German-speaking Jews in British uniforms, and the very existence of those men created what German authorities feared: ideological contamination. Not by leaflets, not by speeches, by direct experience. But the story isn't done tightening, because as the Allies push into Germany itself, ex-troops' work reaches a point that's almost unbearable to imagine. They don't just use German culture as a weapon anymore. They return to it. They step back into the towns that expelled them, the streets where their families lived, the places where their lives were taken apart, now wearing British uniforms, now holding authority, now deciding who gets questioned, who gets detained, who gets protected. That's where Part 3 goes, because the final stage of ex-troop's story isn't just about battlefield effectiveness. It's about the most profound kind of victory, surviving erasure, then walking back into the world that tried to make you disappear. March 1945. The war in Europe is breaking apart at the seams. Allied forces are pushing into Germany itself. Towns are falling. Units are retreating in fragments. The Reich is still dangerous, but it's no longer steady. And now, X Troop reaches the part of the story that hits hardest, because for these men, the front line isn't just a military boundary anymore, it's personal geography. They're moving into the same country that stripped them of rights, that burned synagogues, that cheered as neighbors were dragged away, that told them they were less than human. Some of these commandos are stepping onto streets they walked as kids, not as refugees, as Allied soldiers, in British uniforms. Imagine what that does to your head. You recognize the shape of a building, the bend of a street, the church tower in the distance. It's all familiar and wrong at the same time. Familiar because your memory is still there, wrong because your community is missing like it was cut out with a knife. For some ex-troop men, returning meant seeing the physical proof of erasure. Jewish shops gone, names scraped off signs, synagogues damaged or demolished, apartments occupied by strangers. And here's the critical thing. The historical record does not support a neat revenge unit story. These men were soldiers under command. They had missions. They were expected to follow military law, and in many documented accounts, they did. That doesn't mean they felt nothing. It means they were carrying everything and still stayed disciplined. That discipline becomes one of the most brutal ironies of the whole unit, because they are now responsible for order and security in places that offered their families none. One documented pattern that shows up in multiple recollections is how naturally their German language authority worked on civilians, not through threats, through conditioning. In many towns, a German-speaking voice with confidence and rank triggers automatic compliance. People answer questions. They point. They give directions. They share what they know about troop movements. Sometimes the civilian doesn't even fully process what's happening. They just hear the right language, the right tone, and their brain falls into the old pattern. Obey the authority figure. And then, in rare moments, the civilian notices something. Your accent. You're from here? That question can freeze the air, because it forces the ex-troop soldier to decide how much of himself he will reveal. In most cases, they didn't announce identities like a dramatic courtroom scene. They didn't give speeches. They did their job. But sometimes, the truth slipped out in a single line. A calm statement like, "Yes, I lived here before my family was driven out." That's not a threat. It's a fact. And it lands heavier than any shouted accusation because it forces the civilian to confront what they've been trying not to think about. The war is ending, and suddenly, the disappeared are not just a rumor or a shameful memory. They are standing in front of you with a uniform and authority. Now, at the strategic level, ex-troop success exposes a contradiction the Nazi system can't solve. The Reich claimed Jews were biologically inferior, weak, incapable, mentally lesser, culturally degenerate. But ex-troops' performance shows the opposite in measurable military terms. These men passed commando training. They operated behind enemy lines. They extracted intelligence at unusually high rates. They penetrated security through language and culture. They helped shape operations by providing fast, accurate information from prisoners. Their impact was tactical, operational, and psychological. And that forces one conclusion: the ideology was false. By 1945, German reports and directives, written by people trained inside Nazi assumptions, sometimes edge toward an unwilling admission that something doesn't add up. They may call it an anomaly or demand reevaluation, but the meaning is clear. Reality didn't match the myth. That's the part of this story that's bigger than any single raid. Ex-troop didn't just fight Germans. They fought the belief system inside German heads. And they did it with the simplest proof possible. They existed. They were competent. They were effective. The ideology said they shouldn't be. So the ideology collapsed under direct experience. And then the war ends. The Reich falls. Germany is occupied. The uniforms change. The flags change. The slogans vanish from public walls like they were never there. And ex-troop, those impossible soldiers, stand in the ruins of the system that tried to delete them. From the outside, that looks like a clean ending. But for many of these men, peace was not clean. Peace meant returning to the reality they feared most. The war could end. and their families could still be gone. Many of them searched for news, for names, for survivors, for any proof that someone they loved made it. A lot of them found silence. Some found confirmation of the worst, and that's where a second kind of erasure begins, one that doesn't involve uniforms or violence. It involves memory, because you'd think a unit like X Troop would be famous. You'd think there would be movies, TV series, big dramatic tributes, but for decades their story stayed thin in the public mind. Part of that is bureaucracy and secrecy. Special operations work is often classified for years. Details stay buried in archives, not because someone is plotting a cover-up, but because wartime systems default to silence, and post-war systems move on. Part of it is discomfort. Post-war Germany didn't want to spotlight stories about Jews who fought back while Germans followed a criminal regime. Shame doesn't like those mirrors. And part of it, especially for a USA audience, is cultural gravity. American war storytelling tends to center American protagonists, American arcs, American payoff. That's not a judgment, it's how national myth-making works. So the popular narrative becomes familiar. American troops storm the beaches, American heroes carry the war, and everyone else becomes supporting cast. In that simplified story, Jewish characters often appear mainly as victims waiting to be rescued. X Troop doesn't fit that template. They aren't passive. They aren't side characters. They're Jewish refugees using elite training and native German identity to dismantle the enemy's confidence from inside. And that complexity is harder to sell as a straightforward 2-hour hero journey, so the story stays smaller than it should be. Meanwhile, X-Troop veterans go back to life carrying something most people around them can't fully understand. Their pre-war identities were complicated. They were German and Austrian by birth, Jewish by heritage, British soldiers by service. And now they were part of Germany's defeat against a Germany that had claimed to represent them while trying to kill them. Some stayed in Britain, building lives under names they'd adopted during the war. Some immigrated elsewhere. Some tried to return to Germany or Austria to reclaim property or seek closure or find answers. But even when they did, public recognition often lagged. And that lack of recognition adds another final irony. Their effectiveness depended on not being seen too clearly. In the field, anonymity helped them survive. Secrecy protected methods. Silence protected families when possible. But over time, silence starts to look like absence. And absence turns into forgetting. That's why this story matters. Not because X-Troop needs to be turned into a legend with fake dialogue and dramatic speeches. None of that is necessary, and much of it isn't supported by documentation anyway. It matters because their real record is already powerful enough. They took the one thing the Nazis claimed to own, German language, German culture, German identity, and proved it was not the Reich's property. They took the very label used to dehumanize them and turned it into a battlefield advantage. They showed that ideology can be beaten not only by firepower, but by contradiction, by living proof. And when you zoom out, that's a lesson bigger than WWII, because propaganda always tries to simplify the world into neat categories: superior and inferior, pure and impure, us and them. X-Troop shattered that kind of thinking the hard way, not with speeches. With results. Now here's the final image I want you to keep. It's not a firefight, not a dramatic explosion. It's quieter. It's a German soldier sitting across a table from an interrogator in a British uniform. The prisoner has spent years hearing that Jews are weak and lesser. He's been fed that story until it feels like physics. Then the interrogator speaks flawless German, maybe even the prisoner's own dialect. He references culture the prisoner barely knows. He demonstrates knowledge, confidence, and control. And the prisoner realizes the propaganda wasn't describing reality. It was describing a fantasy the Reich needed to survive. That realization inside a soldier's mind might be one of the most damaging weapons the Allies ever used against Nazi ideology, because once a man truly understands he's been lied to, the war inside his head changes. And that's what X-Troop did, over and over. They didn't just capture positions, they captured certainty. They forced the enemy to fear the sound of his own language in the dark. They turned "you don't exist" into "we're standing right here." And if you're thinking, "how have I never heard this before?" you're not alone. That's why this story should be told more. So here's what I'll ask, and I'll keep it simple. If you want more WWII stories that the usual movies skip, hit the bell so you don't miss the next upload. This channel is built for the overlooked parts of the war, because the men of X Troop didn't fight to be celebrated. They fought because a regime tried to erase them. They refused. They proved it with skill, discipline, and sheer effectiveness. The question now is whether we let the world keep forgetting them, or whether we decide that history is bigger than the versions we grew up watching.